Hi, welcome to Information Security Fundamentals. This course is meant for anyone curious about InfoSec and just starting out in this field. Terminology and concepts are explained with the goal of being clear even to those who hear of them for the very first time. In this brief introduction to InfoSec, we'll cover the CIA Triad, risk management, some cryptography basics and the different keys used there, authentication and authorization, some of the most common cybersecurity attacks, and more. Hi, welcome to your first lesson. Here we'll briefly discuss what is information security, why is it so important today, and how it came to be. How and why was it created? Well, InfoSec is not an innovative idea someone came up with one day and solved it worldwide. To the contrary, it was created out of a need. In the 1970s, first computer systems popped up, and this was also the beginning of information security. Actually, the first ever mention of what is now one of the most important concepts in security, passwords, happened in 1968. Anyway, long story short, information security started as soon as first computer systems interconnected. This, of course, we all know was ARPANET. In 1971, users of then ARPANET started getting a message on their screens. I'm the creeper, catch me if you can. It is considered to be the first computer worm, and it spread to other systems by replicating itself. It is said that its creator had no malicious intents. However, it opened the door for other attacks. To make this very long history shorter, the first recorded denial of service attack happened in 1989, and in the same year, first ransomware attack was detected as well. It was called AIDS Trojan and distributed by floppy disks via regular door-to-door mail. This, of course, triggered lawmakers to do something about it, and just a year later, an act was passed in the UK that made any unauthorized access to computer systems illegal. Information security, sometimes shortened to InfoSec, is the practice of protecting information by mitigating information risks. This is a definition. We'll of course talk details soon and go through much more concepts than are mentioned here. But this one sentence sums InfoSec quite well. It's all about protecting information and mitigating risks. So we just established that our top goal here is to protect information, the center part of this picture here. But how do we do that? You can protect information by encrypting it, but you must also consider surrounding factors. As is depicted here, information is transmitted when we communicate, so we need to protect the communications channels. Information is stored on hardware, so we need to protect the hardware too. And then we use software to, for example, process information. Therefore, software is a major factor as well. That's it for this lesson. We continue to get into more details in the next one. See you there. In this lesson, I want to tell you about all the different security disciplines, meaning all those different security teams you've heard of or saw in the job advertisements, for example. There's information security, which is the topic of this entire course. And in short, you'll hear the name InfoSec too. There's also physical security, cybersecurity, fraud, and companies might have other security teams focused on specific issues, such as network security, for example. Let's get into more details of each of these. We can start from InfoSec. The main responsibility of the InfoSec team is to establish company-wide policies that incorporate selected standards and/or best practices. These policies will almost always apply to each and every employee, but that's not the end of the task. Compliance to the established policies must be monitored, and a process for ensuring compliance shall also be put in place. In practice, to accomplish this, a minimum of 3 steps is necessary, but the list is usually longer. First, an information security policy mandatory for all employees and sometimes contractors as well. Second, a monitoring process that describes technical and procedural activities needed to ensure non-compliance can be identified. And then third, an incident management process that describes the steps to be taken when non-compliance happens and is registered during the monitoring process. Second security team any company with physical presence has is physical security. What I mean by that is unless you're a digital company that doesn't have any, stores or offices or data centers, then you'll likely need to deal with physical security too. Physical security is not just about bodyguards keeping thieves away. It's also about video surveillance, access such as identity cards procedures, printing of the cards, logging when the cards are used to enter premises, etc. You'll see some real-world examples of this later in our lesson called Authentication versus Authorization. Anyways, third security team that not all companies and institutions actually need, but are very common in banks, for example, are anti-fraud teams. What they do is, as the name says, investigate frauds. Sometimes they'll find some loopholes themselves and try to fix them before the bad guys find out. Sometimes they will respond to reports of fraud, often reported by the victims themselves. And since I already mentioned banks, you can probably guess which ones these are. Usually credit card related fraud incidents. Fourth, and the most interesting team, in my humble opinion, is cybersecurity. Now, cybersecurity in itself can be split up into subcategories, but in a nutshell, this is where all the operational tasks fall into. For example, while InfoSec might write the incident response procedure, it's the cybersec crew who actually respond to and resolve security incidents. Also, security analysts investigating logs and alerts are also belonging here. So do network, cloud, application, infrastructure, OS security experts. That was it in the nutshell. We'll discuss more about the tasks all of these teams do in the following lessons, so see you there. Hi, welcome to your second lesson. This time we discuss one of the most important principles in security, the CIA Triad. As you can already see here, it stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Let's get into the details of each three. The first principle of the CIA Triad, confidentiality, is the concept of measures used to ensure protection of secrecy of data, objects, or resources. Since I mention objects, let me explain. An object is the passive element in a security relationship, such as files, computers, network connections, and applications, for example. On the other hand, a subject is the active element in a security relationship. Examples would be users, programs, and computers. A subject acts upon or against an object, and the management of the relationship between subjects and objects is known as access control. Hopefully, we have all at least heard of access control. Now, if a security mechanism offers confidentiality, it actually offers a high level of assurance that data, objects, or resources are restricted from unauthorized subjects. If a threat exists against confidentiality, unauthorized disclosure could take place. Now, the goal of confidentiality protection is to prevent or minimize unauthorized access to data. Confidentiality focuses security measures on ensuring that no one other than the intended recipient, and this is very important, no one other than the intended recipient of a message receives it or is able to read it. So even if they can receive the message, they can't understand it. Hopefully you understand that we would achieve that with encryption. So if a message is encrypted and meant for a specific person to receive it, only the receiver will have the proper key to be able to decrypt the message and read it. So confidentiality protection provides a means for authorized users to access and interact with resources, but it actively prevents unauthorized users from doing so. A wide range of security controls can provide protection for confidentiality, including but not limited to encryption, access controls, and even steganography. In general, for confidentiality to be maintained on a network, data must be protected from unauthorized access, use, or disclosure while in storage or in process or in transit. So it doesn't matter where it is, it has to be protected. Unique and specific security controls are required for each of these states of data, of resources and objects, so that we can say that we are maintaining confidentiality. I must mention that violations of confidentiality are not limited to directed intentional attacks. Many instances of unauthorized disclosure or sensitive confidential information are unfortunately the result of human error, oversight, or simply ineptitude. Before we dive into integrity, you should remember that confidentiality, which we just talked about, and integrity depend on each other. Without object integrity, confidentiality cannot really be maintained. But let's clarify what is integrity. Integrity is the concept of protecting the reliability and correctness of data. Integrity protection prevents unauthorized alterations of data and ensures that data remains correct, unaltered, and preserved. Properly implemented integrity protection provides a means for authorized changes while protecting against intended and malicious unauthorized activities such as viruses and intrusions, as well as mistakes made by authorized users, such as mistakes or oversight. For integrity to be maintained, objects must retain their veracity and be intentionally modified by only authorized subjects. So previously with confidentiality, we talked about authorized access. Now we talk about authorized modification. If a security system or a security mechanism says that it offers integrity, it means that it offers a high level of assurance that the data, objects, and resources are unaltered from their original protected state. So they are original, they are not changed by an unauthorized subject. Alterations should not occur while the object is in storage, in transit, or in process. Thus, maintaining integrity means the object itself is not altered and the operating system and programming entities that manage and manipulate the object are also not compromised. Now, for integrity to be maintained on a system, controls must be in place to, most importantly, again, restrict access to data, objects, resources. Additionally, activity logging should be employed to ensure that only authorized users are able to access their respective resources. Now, numerous attacks focus on the violation of integrity. These include viruses, logic bombs, unauthorized access. Unauthorized access in itself is an attack. Then errors in coding and applications, malicious modification, intentional replacement, or system backdoors even. As with confidentiality, integrity violations are not limited to intentional attacks or malicious attacks. Human error, again, oversight or ineptitude accounts for many instances of unauthorized alteration of sensitive information. Events that lead to integrity breaches include modifying or deleting files, entering invalid data, altering configurations, including errors in commands, codes, and scripts, maybe by accident introducing a virus, executing malicious code, such as a Trojan horse. Also, integrity violations can occur because of the actions of any user, including administrators. The third principle of the CIA Triad is availability, which means authorized subjects are granted timely and uninterrupted access to objects. In simple English, a good example would be your internet provider. You want to have a provider with high availability. It means that you will be able to use their service almost always, ideally always, but with rare interruptions, if any interruptions at all. Loss of availability in this example would be if their, and as a consequence, your internet connection as well, goes down. Availability also implies that the supporting infrastructure, including access control mechanisms, are functional and allow authorized users to gain authorized access. So, for example, if you're trying to use some service on a website, you should at least be able to log in. If you're not able to log in, that's again an availability issue. Some parts of that service are not available to you, and therefore you cannot access the resources or the service or whatever you are using from them. As for threats, similarly to the previous two, there are numerous threats to availability as well. These include device failure, usually hardware failure, physical failure, but also software errors, environmental catastrophes such as flooding, power loss, earthquakes, and so on. There are also some forms of attacks that focus on violation availability that are, of course, malicious. The most famous one would be DDoS attacks or DOS attacks, object destruction, and communication interruptions, but those also happen as a consequence of DDoS attacks. But again, loss availability is not always due to malicious attacks. Some events that lead to availability breaches include accidentally deleting files, overutilizing a hardware or software component, or even in cloud environments, for example, under allocating resources. So that's an important one as well. All right, that was the basics of the CIA Triad. Of course, there are other terms and concepts we need to learn too. So let's do a quick test. Don't worry, this doesn't impact your certificate. Just try to answer the questions best you can. And I'll see you in the next lesson. Now that we've covered the CIA Triad, which includes the most important security concepts, in this lesson, we'll cover some other terms that are also very important. Actually, there's many. Sensitivity, concealment, secrecy, privacy, isolation, seclusion, non-repudiation, that one's important, usability, accountability, accessibility, discretion, and finally, criticality. Let's start from sensitivity. Sensitivity refers to the quality of information which could cause harm or damage if disclosed. Maintaining confidentiality of sensitive information helps to prevent harm or damage. To better explain it, sensitivity is similar to classification. For example, a document aimed for a wider audience, for example, an advertisement, could be classified as public, but military intelligence information is likely to be classified secret or even top secret if needed. Now on to concealment. Concealment is the act of hiding or preventing disclosure. In practice, what does that mean? Well, it means you're hiding something. What does it mean in security? Let me give you an example. Let's say you work for a company that uses a web application firewall and other security systems as well, but let's use a web application firewall here for the sake of an example. So your company knows it's not the best firewall out there, or it may even be aware of the fact that there are some vulnerabilities in it. Concealment in this case would mean that your company bans its employees from disclosing the type of firewall it uses and potentially even the vendor of that firewall. The logic there being, if an attacker doesn't know what kind of defense systems we use, they can't attack us. This is, of course, wrong, and we'll talk about that later, because scanning an environment to find out what kind of infrastructure a target has is one of the first steps hackers will take, and it's also not that complex. Now, secrecy. It should be straightforward. It's all about keeping information secret. Depending on the kind of information an organization is dealing with, it will define the level. It, meaning the organization, will define for itself the level of protection needed for different classes of data. On the other hand, privacy usually refers to information that contains personal data or information that, if leaked, might cause harm. We'll talk later about some laws and regulations that aim to protect privacy. Isolation is a concept very much applicable in IT security. For example, an important security principle is to segregate networks, meaning you will ideally have a separate little network for each different service. And this is even more important in cloud, but that is out of scope for our topic here. Simply put, isolation is the act of keeping something separated from others. It can be used to prevent co-mingling of information or disclosure of information. Each organization needs to evaluate the nuances of confidentiality they wish to enforce. What this means is, I mentioned network segregation a moment ago. Well, long story short, doing that increases cost. So the more network segregation or any type of complicated settings really increases your costs. So organizations will certainly look into if that is absolutely necessary and if it is, at what length. Our next concept, seclusion, is very much related to isolation. The difference is an admittedly small nuance. Seclusion involves storing something in an out-of-the-way location. Unlike isolation, it focuses on one object, making sure it is quote unquote out of the way, as the definition says. Isolation, on the other hand, is more like an overall approach that applies to all, whatever it is we're talking about, either all data or all assets, while seclusion focuses on a singular object. Non-repudiation. It's actually a rather important one. It goes, non-repudiation ensures that the subject of an activity or who caused an event cannot deny that the event occurred. Let me give you an example here. Say there's an administrator, a system administrator, who steals some information from a server and then deletes any logs that might prove that the system admin did that. In order to ensure non-repudiation, you'd introduced what is called a segregation of duties, meaning if an administrator has such rights to make important changes on a given system, they cannot also have the same rights on the logging system. Often activity logs are collected in some central place, such as a data lake or a CM, and organizations will be better off if they make sure that the same people cannot access everything. In this case, both the systems they might either unintentionally or intentionally compromise, and also the system that logs their activities. This, of course, is just one example. It can also be achieved with digital signatures, which are included in the concepts mentioned on the slide: identification, authentication, authorization, accountability, and auditing. Next, we have usability, and this is a rather straightforward concept. In information security, we define usability as something, usually application, platform, framework, that is easy to use or learn how to use. The reason why we at all mention it here is because oftentimes security will be at odds with usability, meaning to increase security, you'll have to, annoy the users with some additional steps, authentication or other checks that will almost always decrease user experience. As an information security expert, you might be tasked with making a decision on such things. Are your security policies really worth the annoyance that users or customers will be subject to? In our previous example with the system admin who maliciously stole some documents off of a server and then tried to cover up, an accountability mechanism would help enable holding that individual accountable, and the consequences for violation of organization's policy are usually described in an employment contract. So, moral of the story, always carefully read your contracts. Just to clarify, I don't expect you to do something illegal and advise you to read the contract to learn how you might get sanctioned, but rather read it so you're familiar with your organization's rules and policies so that you're sure to follow them. Accessibility is very similar to availability with only a nuanced difference. Availability might mean that the web server is up, for example, a web server. So the web server is up, that means it's available, it's powered on, and the OS is running, but the web application has a bug. And for example, users can't perform a certain function. Next, we have discretion. Per definition, it is an act of decision where an operator can influence or control disclosure in order to minimize harm or damage. Another important term that also contains this word is discretionary access controls. And that is a system that allows the owner, or like a data custodian of an object, to control and define access to that object. All objects should have owners, and access control is based on the discretion or decision of the owner. Hopefully that makes sense. And finally, our last concept, criticality. It's best described as a level to which information is mission critical, meaning how important it is to an organization. Usually, the more important it is, the more need there is to keep it confidential. And that's it. By the way, the list goes on, but since this is a fundamentals course, even this list is quite comprehensive. The most important takeaway from this is that there's nuanced differences between these terms, and why understanding that is important is if you're ever faced with an audit, for example, and you claimed in your policy that you enforce some of these concepts, the auditors are going to ask you to prove it. So you want to avoid failing an audit just because you use the term you thought was a synonym when it turns out it's not. Anyway, that's it for this lesson. See you in the next one. If you thought we were done with deep diving into terminology, well, think again. This time we talk about authorization and authentication. These are one of the core concepts in InfoSec, which is why it's important for you to understand clearly the difference. First, let's separate the two terms. Authentication means proving that you are who you say you are. Authorization is about after we have established that you are you, then we need to check where do you have access. For example, if we look at a data center, and for the sake of this example, let's say there is a security guard and a list of people who are allowed to get in. John Smith is one of them, and he is an electrician. John will have his smart card ID, which is at the same time an access card, and that ID will identify him. And that part is authentication, as only John should have his ID card. Now, you might think, well, what if someone steals it or finds it after John has dropped it somewhere, and then they show up at this data center and pretend they're John? Well, it would help if you had a photo on that ID card so that the security guard can compare the person saying they are John to the picture on the ID card. Or additionally, you might enforce a PIN to go with the card. In that case, it would not be enough for this person to show up with John's ID and claim they're John. They would also need to know the PIN code. But all right, let's assume it is John and he comes to the data center, has his ID, looks like himself on that photo on the ID, and also knows his PIN. The security guard might also check his list, and if John is on the list, he will let him through. That is authentication. John has been authenticated as himself. Now comes the interesting part, authorization. John is an electrician, so maybe he will only have access to electricity rooms where the power stuff is located, meaning he will not be allowed into, for example, server rooms. And yes, disclaimer, yes, of course, I'm aware that maybe some electricity work might be needed in a server room too, but if that kind of access is needed, it can be allocated to John's ID card, which again also serves as an access card. All right, finally, authorization. Let's say that this is where John has access. That is, this is where John is authorized to access. He will walk through a hallway, bring his card to the card reader next to this room's door, and type in his PIN. If he is indeed authorized to enter and his PIN is correct, the door will unlock. For the sake of example, let's introduce Sally to our scenario, and let's say she's an IT engineer. By the way, I tried really hard to make her look like an IT admin. Let me know in the Q&A section if it worked. Anyway, she will have different authorization than John, and it might look like this, for example. So the blue boxes would be where Sally is allowed to go in, and the red box would be where John, the electrician, is allowed to go in. That was a very simple, practical explanation of these two very important security concepts. Hope it was clear for you, and see you in the next lecture. In this lesson, we discuss cryptography. Let's start with the definition, shall we? Cryptography is a method of storing and transmitting data in a particular form so that only those for whom it is intended can read and process it. Cryptography is closely related to the disciplines of cryptology and cryptanalysis. It includes technologies such as microdots, merging words with images, and other ways to hide information. That's the main goal here, hide information. To add to that, there are a few important terms you should know of. First, plain text. It's basically the message being transmitted in human readable form or in clear text. Encryption is the method which we can use to hide the meaning of plain text. Ciphertext, unlike plain text, is a message that has been treated, so to say, by an encryption algorithm or method and is not readable for anyone who does not know the key or how to reverse the encryption. And finally, decryption is the way we can recover the plain text out of a cipher. Now, since I mentioned a key in the previous slide, and we will talk more about this later in the lesson, I just want to give you a short visual of what a key does. Basically, if there was no key and we only used an encryption and decryption mechanisms, then everyone could simply use the same mechanism to decrypt our messages, and that would be it. With a key which is unique to us, we ensure that only the rightful recipient of the message can read it, as we will share our unique key with them, or we will designate our message to be unlockable by the recipient's key. We'll discuss this in more detail later on. Now, I want to tell you about an example that is used in almost every cryptography lesson I ever heard of, the Caesar's cipher. It was one of the first well-known methods of encryption, and by today's standards, it was fairly simple. This is how it worked. A military general, for example, would form a message aimed at a remote part of his army. For the sake of this example, we'll use the phrase "send troops." In essence, what it does is it replaces each letter in the message with a letter, a certain number of steps down the alphabet. We'll use it to encrypt our "send troops" message. We'll use 3 steps. By the way, the number of steps is our key, and both the sender and receiver must use the same key to be able to decrypt the message. All right, let's go step by step. The first letter, letter S, moved 3 steps down the alphabet is X. Next letter, E, plus 3 is going to be H. Next letter, N, plus 3 is going to be Q. Next letter, D, plus 3 is going to be G. Okay, now we've reached the space, the empty space between two words, send and troops. Usually, the user of this encryption method would add several signs to the end of the alphabet and then simply continue using the same rule of replacing it with the letter or sign, the predefined number of steps down the alphabet. But here we're just going to leave it as a space. So since you've already hopefully understood the mechanism, we don't need to continue the step-by-step exercise. So here is the final cipher. Of course, this kind of a cipher today would be easy to crack fairly quickly, even without compute power, meaning by a human, which is why nowadays we use super complex algorithms and keys, and even those will be easily broken in the future. Nowadays, you can maybe crack them using supercomputers, but since not everyone has access to those, we're still relatively safe using today's crypto algorithms. All right, as promised, we're going to talk more about keys now. First off, there's two general types of keys used in encryption today, symmetric and asymmetric. As the names already uncover, symmetric key is the same on both the sender and receiver's end. Both of them use the same key in their encryption and decryption algorithms, but keep in mind that this only makes it so much more important to keep that one key super safe, secure, and most importantly, secret. Asymmetric key, on the other hand, is different in that there are two keys, public and private. As our definition here says, one key is used to encrypt the plain text and the other is used to decrypt the cipher. It's not important which key is used first, but sender and receiver must have both for the method to work. To summarize what we just talked about, symmetric key, same algorithm on both sides, same key. Crucial part is to keep the key secret. Asymmetric key, different algorithms are used for encryption and decryption, and there is a pair of keys, private and public. One key is used to encrypt, the other to decrypt. The private key needs to be kept secret. Public can be, as the name implies, out there and known to the public. By the way, our example of Caesar's cipher is a symmetric key mechanism. And now, last example, we're sending hello from the computer to some database. There's a public key. It is known both to sender and receiver. And then the computer has its own private key. And the receiver, in this case a server, has its own private key. The sender encrypts the message using the public key. Then the message is transferred as a cipher, but then the receiver decrypts the message using their private key. This is how we ensure that only the intended recipient can open and read the sent message. That's it on the topic of encryption. See you in our next lesson. In this lesson, we'll talk about the three security terms that are so often used interchangeably, but they shouldn't. It's risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. So let's see what each actually means. Risk is a potential for loss, damage, or destruction of assets or data caused by a cyber threat. But what is a threat then? A threat is a process that magnifies the likelihood of a negative event, such as an exploit of a vulnerability. That brings us to the definition of vulnerability. And a vulnerability is a weakness in your infrastructure, networks, or applications that potentially exposes you to threats. Let's look at an example of something not related to IT to better understand the meaning of these three terms. We're going to talk about hurricanes. The threat of a hurricane is outside one's control. However, knowing that a hurricane could strike can help business owners assess weak points and develop an action plan to minimize impact. In this scenario, a vulnerability would be not having a data recovery plan in place in the event that your physical assets are damaged as a result of the hurricane. The risk to your business would be the loss of information or a disruption in business as a result of not addressing your vulnerabilities. One more thing to cover here is the risk formula. What this formula illustrates is that if one aspect of risk, such as threat or vulnerability, can be brought down to a manageable level, the value of risk as a whole also gets reduced. But how do you reduce threat or vulnerability? You can't actually reduce threat as it is an outside factor, but you can get the threats applicable to your organization under control or manage them by ensuring that your team members are staying informed of current threats in cybersecurity so they can quickly identify new threats. You can and should perform regular threat assessments to determine the best approaches to protecting a system against a specific threat, along with assessing different types of threats. You can also conduct penetration testing by modeling real-world threats in order to discover vulnerabilities. Also, you can get your vulnerabilities under control too by one, developing a vulnerability management program, which includes constant vulnerability assessment and vulnerability remediation. You should make sure that vulnerabilities that are discovered are remediated. And you should ensure that security patches are applied as soon as they are available. That's it for our short lesson on these three important security concepts. We will discuss more about them in the following lessons, so see you there. We are starting a new chapter, and since it's called governance, let me first explain what governance is, at least in context of security. According to NIST, which is an American National Institute of Standards and Technology, information security governance can be defined as the process of establishing and maintaining a framework to provide assurance that information security strategies are aligned with and support business objectives, are consistent with applicable laws and regulations through adherence to policies and internal controls, and provide assignment of responsibility, all in an effort to manage risk. Hold on a second. This is a very long sentence. Let's break it into smaller pieces that will be easier to understand. Let's imagine a company. It's a corporation and it has a CEO, a CFO, CIO, which is important for us. That's a Chief Information Officer, and COO, Chief Operations Officer. They also have a CISO who reports to the CIO, and then they'll have one or several security managers, and then the real folks who do the actual job, system admins, network admins, security admins, and then if there is additional hierarchy among experts, they will also have technicians who might also be administrators, but they will usually be juniors or might have limited access rights. All right, well, a large organization will more likely have a so-called top-down approach to security governance. This means that security governance starts with upper management. And that further implies that top-level managers are the ones responsible for initiating, creating, and implementing your data protection strategy, including policy creation, procedural instructions, and escalation plans. They may not do this themselves. It's hard to imagine a busy CEO sitting down and writing a password policy, for example, but they may seek outside assistance or a professional partnership with some professional InfoSec service, a consultancy, and so on. On the opposite side, we have a bottom-up approach, which would mean that the IT staff makes security decisions directly without input from senior management. It's rarely used in organizations, and especially in large organizations, and it is actually considered problematic in the IT industry. As a summary for this lesson, you should remember that ultimately security governance is the implementation of security. It directly oversees and gets involved in all levels of security. You should also remember that security is not and should not be treated as an IT issue only. Instead, security affects every aspect of an organization. It is no longer just something the IT staff can handle on their own. It's meaning security is a business operations issue. It is an organizational process, not just something the IT or network admins do behind the scenes. Using the term security governance is an attempt to emphasize this point by indicating that security needs to be managed and governed throughout the organization, not just the IT department. In this lesson, we'll discuss security policies. It's different from governance, which we have already covered, and you'll see how in the following slides. A security policy is a document that states in writing how a company plans to protect its physical and information technology assets. Security policies are living documents. That means they can and should continuously be updated and change as technologies, vulnerabilities, and security requirements change as well. By definition, these documents, I mean security policies, should be clear, comprehensive, and well defined. They consist of plans, rules, and practices that regulate, for example, access to an information system. Let's look at some policy examples. Here I put a link to the SANS Institute's web page where they keep an open database of some security policy templates. This is free for use by individuals or organizations. When you click on the link, you'll be thrown to this list of all the available policy templates, and I've chosen the email policy, which I've already opened, because you are all surely familiar with use of emails. Let's look at some of the rules under policy. We can maybe look at this 4.8 rule. Users are prohibited from using third-party email systems and storage servers such as Google, Yahoo, MSN, Hotmail, etc. to conduct insert company name. So let's say the company's name is Quince, for example, business to create or memorialize any binding transactions, blah, blah, blah. So this is an example of a policy. You can go back to this website and find maybe some other policy templates that might be interesting to you. All right, now that we've covered policy, let me clarify the difference between a policy and a procedure. By definition, a security procedure is a set of, or it's a set sequence of necessary activities that performs a specific security task or function. But what does that really mean? Well, security procedures are detailed step-by-step instructions on how to implement, enable, or enforce security controls as written in your, guess where, security policies. For example, if we continue down the path of the policy we looked at a minute ago, the SANS template for email policy, we might develop a procedure to monitor and, if needed, sanction non-compliance to that policy. This is a wildly trivialized example here, but just so that you get an idea, you might write in your policy, 1, defining how you might identify that someone has breached the policy rules. For example, there is that rule in the policy that forbids forwarding of company emails to some private email accounts. That is something that you could monitor with software and develop an alert to pop up in case someone forwards, let's say, more than 3 emails to some personal account. You might think 1 or 2 is fine, 1 or 2 forwarded emails is fine, but more than that would be maybe suspicious. So you create a rule in the procedure. 2, validation. Even if you get an automated alert, you should check the facts before concluding that an individual has broken the rules. Sometimes the alert rule is not configured properly and you get a false positive, or the colleague is perhaps a sales agent and they were simply sending some commercial prospects to a client. Either way, this is something you'd make sure to include in your procedure. Also, if validation requires you to access someone's inbox, you might want to get approval for that. So you should not have employees or administrators just freely reading other people's emails. 3, you create a template within the procedure of how to communicate to employees who pop up in alerts or are reported by other employees even. It might be via telephone, via email, via their boss, etc. But this is something to define in a procedure. And finally, you define the consequences for policy non-compliance. It might be suspension from work, termination of contract, bonus reduction, or sometimes just a reprimand, or even nothing. It's up to you, the procedure writer. All right, hopefully that was clear for you. Let me know if you have any questions in the Q&A section or via direct messages. In this lesson, we talk about security audits. What is a security audit? A cybersecurity audit is a comprehensive review of an organization's IT infrastructure, policies, procedures, compliance to laws and regulations, whatever the scope of the audit. But it focuses on the IT infrastructure. It ensures that appropriate policies and procedures had been implemented and are working effectively. The goal is to identify any vulnerabilities or other issues that could result in a breach. These will be listed in the audit report to be used by the organization to remediate and resolve one by one issue listed there. It should also be performed by a qualified third party. The reason behind this is simple. If it were to be performed by internal employees, they might not be as objective as an outsider. As already mentioned, the result of the audit will be a report in the form of a list of things to improve. Obviously, as an organization fixes one by one the issues listed there, their security posture will improve. In this slide, compliance posture is mentioned too. That refers to companies' compliance to applicable privacy laws and regulations, or potentially other laws that are the scope of the audit. Why do we conduct cybersecurity audits? The main reason to conduct cybersecurity audits is to identify and address security and compliance weaknesses. Through a thorough assessment, an organization will inevitably gain a comprehensive overview of its systems, how they are connected, why they are connected, and even highlight some configurations, entire systems, or connections that are obsolete. That in itself reduces chances of a successful breach. Hello again. This time we talk about risk management, more precisely security risk management. Security risk management is the ongoing process of identifying security risks and implementing plans to address them. It is a detailed process of identifying factors that could damage or disclose data, evaluating those factors in light of data value and countermeasure costs, and implementing cost-effective solutions for mitigating or reducing risk. An important term here, cost-effective. As an organization, you will always choose between security and something, whether it be user experience or time or money. It's always going to be a decision to be made based on weighing the two sides against each other. Is the risk greater than the cost for that security measure you want to implement? For example, if you need to pay $1 million to buy some next generation firewall to protect an asset that you could replace for only a portion of that money, you'll end up asking yourself, or your boss might end up asking you, hey, is it really worth that money? Anyway, what you should take away from this short lecture is that the overall process of risk management is used to develop and implement information security strategies. The goal of these strategies is to reduce risk and to support the mission of the organization. Hopefully, you'll be able to remember that. That's it for this lesson. Shall you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A section. See you in the next one. This will again be a short lesson. We'll briefly go over what are data privacy laws and regulations. But first, we'll define data privacy. Per definition, data privacy, also called information privacy, is an aspect of data protection that addresses the proper storage, access, retention, immutability, and security of sensitive data. Okay, so first off, we should highlight that there is no one global data privacy law or agreement. Even if you look at one country, such as the USA, there is no one comprehensive federal law that governs data privacy. Instead, there's a bunch of sector-specific and medium-specific laws. For example, laws and regulations that address telecommunications, health information, credit information, financial affairs, etc. Canada has a similar situation to the US. There's several different bills that cover this topic. In Mexico, the protection of personal data is even listed as a fundamental right in their constitution. And in South America, several countries recently introduced GDPR-inspired data protection laws. In Europe, there's GDPR, as already mentioned, but even that does not apply to all countries, only the ones in European Union. And each country inside the EU can still have their own local laws, regulations, or policies on top of the GDPR. In Africa, some countries, for example, Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, have data privacy laws that share some elements from the GDPR. Others have something more specific to them, but overall, I found information from this year that only half of African countries have enacted data privacy laws or policies. As for Asia, again, it's pretty mixed up. What I'd highlight there is that several countries also have these under the constitution on top of dedicated laws. Not to forget the faraway Australia, they of course do have such laws, and actually for a very long time. A law similar to GDPR was in place there since 1988. That's all good and nice, but what do we have to do about this? Here's a quick checklist if you ever need to worry about privacy laws and or regulations. First of all, whatever industry or jurisdiction you're in, stay up to date about privacy laws and regulations. Then, of course, be compliant to those. Know what information needs to be protected and at what level, too. You'll have a greater chance in accomplishing this if you implement a company-wide policy that clearly describes what behavior is acceptable and what isn't. Third, partner with reliable third-party entities for auditing, shredding, consulting, etc. You might achieve this by also requiring your partners, contractors, or other third-party entities to have certifications of their own for complying with the applicable laws, regulations, or policies. That's it for this very short lesson. See you in the next one. In this lesson, we discuss application security. As always, let's clarify what is application security. In essence, everything you do to ensure the software you are creating is secure can be considered application security. Now let's talk about how to actually secure applications. Bear in mind that everyone can choose to take care of their software security differently, and that these are only suggestions and ideas on what steps might be taken. Without further ado, let's get into it. First, you'll want to implement SDLC. It's a framework for software development. In plain English, it defines a process for building software by describing steps and phases. If you include security in your software development lifecycle, you've already set yourself up for success in regards to application security. Second, you'll want to make sure that your developers are up to date with the latest OWASP top 10 threats. Being informed about what the emerging threats and their specifics is the first step in ensuring that your development team will consider the security aspect of their code. Third, and this might sound simple, but believe me, I've worked in large corporations and I've seen it firsthand so many times. Whether it's developers or project managers, they often remember security only when it's too late. The product is already almost finished. So this little advice will help you a lot if you implement it. In short, make sure that from the very beginning of the development process, security is taken into consideration. Next, you'll want to, wherever possible, enforce industry application security standards and best practices. These evolve very quickly, so you need to make a conscious effort in keeping your team up to date with those. Number 5, implement secure application design and architecture. 6, ensure secure coding practices for input validation, authentication, and authorization. We've already talked about authentication and authorization, but input validation is just as important when it comes to security. Also, it would be smart to instill in your team a culture of secure coding, cryptography, session management, and error handling. I know that at this point there are so many points, but each of these can potentially be exploited by an attacker and cause the same level of destruction as any of the other bugs or vulnerabilities. Next, it is extremely important to, if even after all the previous steps were done correctly, some vulnerabilities still persist, rate the severity of defects and publish comprehensive reports detailing the associated risks and mitigations of the vulnerabilities. Now, when you've covered the basics, it's time to scan your application. There are many tools for this and some that are even free. Here you'll want to look into SAST or DAST scanners. It's short for Static Application Security Testing and Dynamic Application Security Testing. Finally, in the end, you need to make sure to maintain the software post-deployment. This ensures security in regards to new issues constantly being discovered, and some of it might affect the code you wrote. And in the past, it might have been completely secure, but now with new exploits discovered, your code must be updated to keep secure. And this is a constant exercise. So make sure to have a application maintenance process. And that would be it on AppSec. Hope you found it somewhat informative. See you in our next lesson. In this section, we'll talk about some of the most common cyber threats today. I'll show you where to find updated lists of those threats, how to learn about details, etc. But now let's answer the question, what is hacking? Per definition, hacking is an act that seeks to compromise digital devices such as computers, smartphones, or even entire networks. Next logical question would be why? Well, there's many motivators behind it, but some of the most prominent ones would be data theft, whether it be for financial gain. For example, lots of stolen data is offered for sale on the dark web. It could be for personal vendetta. It could be to damage a brand's reputation. Next, gaining access. While it could be inspired by any of the other 3 points here, it could also be done for curiosity, personal interest, or you know what? I actually have an interesting example here from my university days. One guy tried breaking into the grading software and he actually did manage to gain access to it, as in he could see other students' grades, professor notes, etc., but he could not change his grade. That was due to authorization, which we learned about earlier. Anyway, moving on to our next point, reputation damage. This occurs especially when there's competition. Let's say that there is a mobile operator and they have one competitor. It could be some very small country like an island, and they have two mobile operators. People will choose the reliable one out of the two or the one that they trust more. If one attacks the other, for example, they could leak damaging information or hit them with a DDoS attack, disabling their internet service. It's an instant gain for the competitor. Fourth example of hackers' goals is activism. Hackers motivated by activism are often called hacktivists. They'll target websites or IT infrastructure of institutions, organizations, or governments that they disagree with. And here are some of the most common security attacks. We'll get into the details in the upcoming lessons, but what's more important right now is for you to know how to find this information. The attacks listed here can be found anywhere on the internet. You can just Google the phrase top security threats and a similar list will pop up. But there is this list which is very well known in the security circles. It's called OWASP Top 10. Let me explain first what OWASP is. First of all, it's short for Open Web Application Security Project, and their top 10 list will tell you what are the most critical security risks to web applications for the previous year. This will be interesting to you if you're an application developer, an application security engineer or specialist, or if you hold any type of security job, you are likely to need this information because you should at least be aware of the current threats existing out there that you might eventually need to defend your organization against. All right, as promised, we'll talk more details in the following lessons. See you there. In this lesson, we talk about the absolute number one issue in security, phishing. Let's get into it. Per definition, phishing is a type of social engineering where an attacker sends a fraudulent message designed to trick a person into revealing sensitive information to the attacker or to deploy malicious software on the victim's infrastructure, like ransomware. Let's see an actual example of what phishing might look like. Let's say that an employee receives an engaging email with a link to follow up. For example, it might be a message from PayPal saying that a transaction has been rejected. If the user initiated some transaction recently, they might want to know what happened with it. And if they didn't, they might think that PayPal stopped a suspicious transaction from happening and will want to see the details. Let's say the email was sent from support@paypal.com instead of support@paypal.com or something similar. The user might easily not pay attention to this difference in one letter and click on a link provided in the body of the message. The landing web page looks exactly like PayPal's landing page, and this is easy for an attacker to achieve. There's actually tools on the dark web that allow you to copy an entire website. Let's say that our target employee then enters their credentials, but instead going to PayPal, they end up going to the attacker who set up the fake website. This is one of the ways hackers generally steal credentials. The attacker might even forward those credentials to the real website and redirect the user there, which is when the real PayPal sends them a second factor of authentication, an email or a text message. To clarify, our target enters their email and password, and since this is a malicious copy of the website, those email and password details go to attacker, who can then use them to log in themselves and pay with this person's PayPal. Um, but then the attacker might also write a script that will open the actual PayPal website, input the credentials from the unsuspecting victim into the real website, and then show the target the actual PayPal page. The target will then access their real account. They will see that there was no transaction rejected and probably think no more of it, assuming that it was a mistake. Of course, we only used PayPal here for the sake of this example, but in reality, attackers will often investigate which tools an organization uses if they are targeting employees of a specific company. They will investigate what does that company use, for example, Microsoft Office tools or communication tools that employees would expect to get emails from, and also for which AD accounts are used. So these Microsoft tools usually have the single sign-on capability, and you can log into them with your AD account. And an attacker getting their hands on AD credentials that belong to an organization is simply invaluable. This way, they are able to collect actual AD usernames and passwords, which they can later use to access systems in later stages of their attack, once they actually get access to the victim's infrastructure. Also, the phishing campaigns might be both targeted and mass oriented. The first one is used when the hacker is missing a specific type of account for their attack. For example, an administrator account or an executive's account. In that case, they might use LinkedIn or other social media to find an employee in a position likely to have needed type of access, and then target them with an email tailored to get the highest chance of victim biting the hook. For example, the hacker might see on target social media that they attended a seminar recently and send them an email saying, "Thank you for attending the seminar. Click here to see the gallery." And the victim might think, "Oh, there might be some nice professional photo of me. I better check that." Hey, when actually they're clicking on a malicious link or even downloading what they might think are pictures or some presentations from the event, but it's actually malicious software. It could be ransomware, for example. On the other hand, we have mass phishing emailing, which is just an attacker randomly sending out real-looking messages, hoping that someone will fall for it. That was it for our example of phishing. See you in the next lesson. Another important type of attack in cybersecurity is DDoS. What is DDoS? Per definition, DOS, short for denial of service, is a resource consumption attack that has the primary goal of preventing legitimate activity on a victimized system. A DOS attack renders the target unable to respond to legitimate traffic. And then DDoS is a distributed DOS attack, which means many attackers target one victim. This is usually achieved using botnets. There are two basic forms of denial of service: Attacks exploiting a vulnerability in hardware or software. This exploitation of a weakness, error, or standard feature of software intends to cause a system to hang, freeze, consume all system resources, and so on. The end result is that the victimized computer is unable to process any legitimate tasks. And then the second form are attacks that flood the victim's communication pipeline with garbage network traffic. These attacks are sometimes called traffic generation or flooding attacks. The end result is that the victimized computer is unable to send or receive legitimate network communications. In either case, the victim has been denied the ability to perform normal operations or services. DDoS isn't a single attack, but rather an entire class of attacks. Some attacks exploit flaws in operating system software, whereas others focus on installed applications, services, or protocols. Some attacks exploit specific protocols, including Internet Protocol, IP, Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, Internet Control Message Protocol, ICMP, and User Datagram Protocol, UDP. Most DOS attacks employ some form of intermediary system. It's usually an unwilling and unknowing participant to hide the attacker from the victim. For example, if an attacker sends attack packets directly to a victim, it's possible for the victim to discover who the attacker is. That is made more difficult, although not impossible, through the use of intermediaries. As can be seen here on this animation, the hacker infects someone else, and once they have control over the intermediary's computer, the hacker then issues a command to them to attack the real target. Many DDoS attacks begin by compromising or infiltrating one or more intermediary systems that then serve as launch points or attack platforms. These intermediary systems are commonly referred to as secondary victims. The attacker installs remote control tools, often called bots, zombies, or agents, onto these systems. Then, at an appointed time or in response to a launch command from the attacker, the DOS attack is conducted against the victim. The victim may be able to discover zombie systems that are causing the DDoS attack, but probably won't be able to track down the actual attacker. Hackers involving zombie systems are known as, attacks involving zombie systems are known as distributed denial of service attacks, as we already mentioned before. Deployments of numerous bots or zombies across numerous unsuspecting secondary victims have become known as botnets. Some countermeasures against DDoS attacks are firewalls, special router configurations. There are even some dedicated standalone anti-DDoS systems that will filter out the bad traffic, or as an organization, you can have an agreement with your service provider, for example, that they can scan your traffic and filter any DDoS or DOS attempts. This is, of course, a paid service usually. There's plenty more to this topic, but for our fundamentals course, this is where we stop. Shall you have any questions? Feel free to raise them in our Q&A section. In this lesson, I'd like us to cover some of the most common security threats: viruses, worms, malware. As always, we start from definitions. A computer virus is a type of computer program that, when executed, replicates itself by modifying other computer programs and inserting its own code. If the replication is successful, we call the affected assets infected. On the other hand, a worm is a standalone malware computer program that replicates itself in order to spread to other computers. It often uses a computer network to spread itself, relying on security failures on the target computer to access it. It will use this machine as a host to scan and infect other computers as well. So there is a slight difference between the worm and a virus. We'll discuss further later. Now, I know the title of this lesson doesn't mention Trojan horses, but let's cover those as well. A Trojan horse virus is a type of malware that downloads onto a computer disguised as a legitimate program. The delivery method typically sees an attacker use social engineering to hide malicious code within legitimate software to try and gain users' system access with their software. And now let's see what is malware. Malware, short for malicious software, is a file or code typically delivered over a network that infects, explores, steals, or conducts virtually any behavior an attacker wants. Now, there are many types of malware, including computer viruses, worms, Trojan horses, ransomware, spyware, adware, etc. We'll discuss these further later on. I put here a table that compares pretty well the three terms, and we'll discuss malware types in general in the following slide. So let's go through this. Viruses must attach to something. That's the key. So they attach to another software, for example, and they're usually executed via executable files. They reach the victim's systems via phishing email, for example, or infected USB sticks that carry the executable. Worms, on the other hand, have a goal of basically wasting computer resources, slowing them down, and making them unusable for the legitimate user. They spread quickly and do so by exploiting vulnerabilities in the systems they find on their spreading path. Now, a Trojan horse has a bit of a different motivation, and that is to steal information. So obviously they are more targeted, and the attackers will want to use them specifically on the victims they want to find out some details about. Okay, now let's see the malware types. Actually, all of the threats we discussed so far in this lesson are also categories of malware. This is because technically malware is a wider term than those, so they can definitely fit into that description. The other terms are quite self-explanatory, but let's quickly burn through them too. Adware serves unwanted advertisements. Basically, adware tracks a user's surfing activity to determine which ads to serve them. Although adware is similar to spyware, it does not install any software on a user's computer, nor does it capture keystrokes. The danger in adware primarily is the erosion of a user's privacy. Ransomware disables victims' access to data until ransom is paid. We hear about these a lot. Spyware collects information about users' activities without their knowledge or consent. This can include passwords, PINs, payment information, and overall unstructured messages. Bots usually are used in large numbers to create a botnet, which is a network of bots used to launch broad, remotely controlled floods of attacks, such as DDoS attacks. Then worms, they spread through networks by replicating themselves. We covered that already. Viruses, as we already established, a virus is a piece of code that inserts itself into an application and executes when the app is run. And an important thing to note is that a virus cannot execute or reproduce unless the app it has infected is actually actively running. Trojans, a Trojan horse disguises itself as desirable code. yeah, already covered. Rootkits, basically rootkits give hackers remote control of a victim's device. Keyloggers monitor users' keystrokes. That's pretty much it. Then wiper malware. This is a type of malware with a single purpose to erase user data beyond recoverability. And that's about it for this lesson. Hope you learned something. Let's continue in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll cover another major security threat, SQL injection. First, what is SQL? SQL, short for Structured Query Language, is a standardized programming language that is used to manage relational databases and perform various operations on the data in them. And here's how an SQL database would look like. This one is obviously some customer management database or something like that. And this is how you would grab data from an SQL database by using the select command. Now, this seems pretty simple to use, and that's all great, but why are we here? Well, this SQL setup and language can be exploited by attackers to grab more data than they should, and that method is called SQL injection. In fact, we will see later that the attackers can do more than just pick up more data, such as replace data, delete data, and so on. A SQL injection attack consists of insertion or injection of a SQL query via the input data from the client to the application. A successful SQL injection exploit can read sensitive data from the database, modify database data via these insert, update, delete commands, execute administration operations on the database, etc. Also, I mentioned in one of the previous lessons that we'll have some examples later on input validation attacks, and SQL injection is one of those. So SQL injection belongs to what is called input validation attacks. How does it really work? Let's look at an example. Here we have a website with some login text boxes. We type in our username, we type in our password, but in the backend, this is what that command sent to the database looks like. And this is the legitimate input. But if we were malicious, we could type in something like this in one of the fields. We'll type in the single quote sign to interrupt the command. If you look at the command that will be sent to the backend database on our right-hand side, it expects a string, but instead we give it a single quote, which closes that field and allows us to inject a different command. Now let's finish that username input. I'm going to insert this and we'll look at what that does later. Now we can just type in anything for the password, really. It doesn't actually matter. But now let's clarify what this OR command does. The way this query is set up is you need the correct username and password in order to be let in, right? Probably after this login page, there are some contents of this website. And in order to get through this login page and to that content, you need to enter the username and the password both correctly because we have this and logical operator in between. But we have injected something in between there that messes that up, as now only one of the two needs to be correct because we gave it an OR logical operator. And on top of that, we inserted a correct statement that 1 equals 1, which is obviously always going to be true, so that we've satisfied the one condition. Therefore, the database will do what it would normally do if the username and password were both correct. This is a rather simple example, but of course, it's possible to do much more. For example, list out the contents of an entire database. Possibly that database is holding credentials such as login information, usernames and passwords. It might be holding card holder data, credit card numbers and credit card pins, etc. But you could also insert data that was not previously there, replace that data with untrue information, or even delete the entire database.